They offered Iran an escape, just one signature, one pen stroke, one piece of paper between decades of sanctions and a future of normalized trade, prosperity, and global respect. The world held its breath. European leaders waited at the table. American negotiators left the door open. Billions in frozen assets could return overnight. Tehran didn't sign. Instead, it chose defiance. The world never expected it. The West miscalculated. Again, the thought every nation had a price. They believed every country would kneel under pressure eventually. But Iran didn't bend. It didn't break. And in that silence, while the ink remained untouched, Iran's message to the world was deafening. We do not sell sovereignty, not for dollars, not for oil, for empty promises, and certainly not for temporary peace while a dagger waits behind the handshake. This was not a diplomatic rejection. It was a declaration of resistance. To understand why Iran refused what seemed like the deal of the century, we need to step back, decades back. Because this moment wasn't born in a Geneva hotel room, crafted over generations of betrayal, war, cups, assassinations, and broken promises. It was shaped in the shadows of 1953, when a democratically elected prime minister was overthrown in favor of a Shah orchestrated by foreign hands. It deepened in 1980, when Saddam Hussein, armed and backed by Western powers, invaded Iran, plunging it into a brutal 8-year war that cost over 1 million lives. War didn't end Iran's isolation, it began it. And so, when the nuclear deal known as the JCPOA came to life in 2015, it wasn't just a negotiation over centrifuges. Gamble between trust and deception, between national pride and survival. Iran signed, the world watched, sanctions were lifted. The West congratulated itself. And then, just as quickly as hope bloomed, it was crushed. In 2018, a single decision from the White House shattered it all. Donald Trump tore up the agreement, reimposed sanctions, and promised to bring Iran to its knees. It was the moment Iranians knew, even if you follow every rule, obey every clause, and submit to every inspection, they'll find a way to punish you. So in 2023, when talks resumed again, this time in Vienna and later in Doha, the tone had changed. Iran wasn't naive anymore. It had learned that deals built on American signatures fade with each new president. It knew that the promises of European allies meant little when Washington held the key to global finance. Iran had one final offer placed on the table. A new version of the deal, economic relief, energy trade, technology transfers, all in exchange for rolling back its nuclear program again. One signature, that's all it took. But Iran refused, and that's where the story turns. Because what followed wasn't isolation, it was alignment, it was realignment, eastward. Iran turned to China, to Russia, to Latin America, to Africa. It signed a 25-year strategic partnership with Beijing. It invited BRICS to the table. It began trading oil in yuan and gold instead of dollars. It strengthened military cooperation with Moscow in ways that alarmed Washington more than any enrichment percentage ever could. This wasn't rogue behavior. This was a pivot. Iran didn't want to be integrated into the Western world. It wanted to help build an alternative to it. And suddenly, it wasn't the West that had the upper hand. It was Iran with leverage. It had energy. It had geography. It had resolve. The Strait of Hormuz remained a chokehold over 20% of the world's oil. And with each drone, missile, and satellite launch, Iran showed it was no longer a third world backwater. It was a rising power with capabilities no one could ignore. Even Israel, the region's most formidable military, had begun to shift its posture. Cyber attacks, assassinations, shadow war strikes. None had broken Iran. They had only emboldened it. Tel Aviv thought would scare Tehran into compliance had simply hardened its resolve. And then came the red line. Iran declared, we will never accept restrictions that treat us differently than any other NPT member. It wasn't a threat. It was a dare to the world. You want us to disarm. Then disarm your allies first. You want inspections. Then open your own sites. You want compliance. Then give us guarantees, not empty papers. Not tweets. Signatures that evaporate every election cycle. The refusal to sign wasn't arrogance, it was strategy. Iran understood that to win this game, you don't play on your opponent's board. You flip the board. You change the rules. You redefine victory, not as submission, but survival with dignity. This wasn't just about centrifuges or uranium. This was about power, about who gets to have it, who gets to keep it, and who gets punished for wanting it. The question wasn't whether Iran comply. The real question was, why should it? And so the world watched and waited. But Iran didn't flinch. It invested in missile defense, expanded regional alliances, and made it clear if conflict comes, it won't be contained to its borders. It will ripple through the Gulf, into Saudi oil fields, into Israeli cities, into American bases. And here lies the paradox. The more they isolated Iran, the more independent it became. The more they sanctioned it, the more self-reliant it grew. The more they threatened war, the more united its people stood. Iran had escaped the trap, not with a signature, by refusing one. And in that refusal, it didn't just challenge a deal. It challenged the world order. It asked her who decides who's dangerous, who defines peace, who deserves trust, and who is forever condemned no matter what they do. The refusal sent shockwaves far beyond Vienna. Behind closed doors, diplomats panicked, intelligence agencies scrambled, Wall Street hesitated, because this wasn't supposed to happen. The game had rules. A nation under crushing sanctions, economically strangled and diplomatically cornered, was supposed to cave. That's what pressure was for. That's why sanctions were designed like weapons, silent but suffocating. Iran had rewritten the script. Instead of collapse, it showed adaptation. Instead of desperation, it displayed determination. They turned to barter deals. They smuggled oil through ghost tankers in the Persian Gulf. They used crypto, yen, rupees, gold, even wheat as currency. Every time the West shut a door, Iran found another path. The message: you may have power, but we have patience. And patience in geopolitics is more lethal than bombs. Meanwhile, inside Iran, the regime faced a new challenge, proving to its own people the cost of defiance was worth it. It wasn't easy. Inflation soared, the currency tumbled, protests flared. But even in moments of unrest, one idea echoing national dignity cannot be negotiated. In mosque marketplaces, military academies, and parliament halls, this single sentence gained power. We will not kneel to betrayal again. Because betrayal had a face. It wore suits in Washington and smiles in Paris. It shook hands in public, then armed Iran's enemies in private. And the Iranian leadership never forgot the moments when they had trusted too much, only to be burned by the same hands offering deals. So, when the deal was placed back on the table, Iran didn't just read the fine print. It asked the question no one wanted to answer. What happens when the next president tears it up again? And when no guarantees were given, Iran answered for itself. No deal. Not this time. Instead, Iran deepened ties with Russia, joining military drills in the Caspian. Its drones appeared over Ukraine, turning Iranian tech into a global talking point. This wasn't just about defense anymore. It was a declaration of capability. Iran could project power across seas, across borders, across narratives. And then came the economic counterstrike. While the West hoped Iran would beg for dollars, Tehran crafted deals in Shanghai, built factories with Chinese capital, and launched its own platforms to replace the SWIFT banking system. And while the West called this isolation, Iran called it liberation. Because to Iran, returning to the Western system was like returning to a prison where the warden changes every few years. You might get fed, you might get ignored, but you're never free. So it turned to multilateralism, to BRICS to SCO, to OPEC+, to a world where America's voice wasn't the final word. And for the first time in decades, Global South listened. Africa invited Iran. Latin America hosted Iranian officials. Even Saudi Arabia, the old rival, agreed to Chinese brokered diplomacy, reopening embassies after years of hostility. What happened? The world was changing, and Iran didn't resist it. It accelerated it. And for the West, this was the nightmare. They didn't just lose control of Iran. They lost the illusion that control was still possible. Because Iran had done the unthinkable, survive without signing, build without begging, rise without approval. And that terrified those who had spent decades telling the world otherwise. Meanwhile, Israel warned of imminent threats from Iran's nuclear progress. Mossad sent agents. Scientists were killed. Explosions rocked underground facilities. Each attack only pushed Iran further. What was supposed to cripple it only hardened its resolve. The West still didn't understand. The more Iran was attacked, the less it feared consequences. Because a nation that survives isolation learns something deadly. It becomes immune to pressure. This wasn't the same Iran from 2003 or 2015. It was smarter, more experienced, and more aligned with a new global axis, one that didn't see America as a compass. And while the media debated enrichment levels and breakout timelines, Iran made moves quietly, oil production up, exports redirected, missiles tested, satellites launched, diplomats welcomed in unexpected places. From Venezuela to South Africa, Iran wasn't a pariah anymore. It was a partner. And as Ukraine dominated headlines and Gaza burned silently, Iran expanded its influence across the Middle East. From Lebanon to Iraq, from Syria to Yemen, not just through arms, but through ideology. resistance against dominance, because for Iran, this was never just a war of weapons. It was a war of worldviews. And in that war, the refusal to sign was a battle cry, a statement of belief that power must be earned, not gifted, that sovereignty is sacred, that no deal, no matter how lucrative, is worth losing the right to decide your own future. And in this refusal, Iran challenged every nation to ask itself, what are we willing to sacrifice for comfort? What are we willing to trade for security? And is a signature worth the soul of a nation? While Western leaders framed Iran's refusal as irrational inside Tehran, it was viewed as inevitable. After all, history had taught them a brutal lesson. Any deal made with the West was temporary, transactional, not transformational. And Iran was no longer interested in being a pawn in someone else's game of power politics. It wanted to be a player. So it chose the harder path, the longer road, the riskier gamble. And while critics called it suicidal, Iran saw it as survival on its terms. This wasn't just about nuclear ambitions. It was about restoring pride to a civilization thousands of years old, one that had been humiliated, invaded, and manipulated in modern times, but never erased. And now it was Iran turning the tables. In Tehran, a quiet revolution was unfolding, not of people, but of policy. Economic models were shifting. Defense strategies were recalculated. Intelligence was localized, and infrastructure projects exploded across the map. Roads, dams, refineries, and railways, all built without IMF loans or Western oversight. The message was clear: we can rebuild without you. We can rise without your permission. This transformation go unnoticed. Western think tanks began ringing alarm bells. Iran's influence was no longer confined to its borders. Its presence was felt across Iraq's politics, Syria's survival, Lebanon's resistance, and even Afghanistan's reshaping. But perhaps the most symbolic shift came not from war, but from words. In 2024, when Iranian officials addressed international forums, they didn't sound defensive. They sounded defiant. They quoted history, international law, and Western hypocrisy with surgical precision. They spoke as equals, not applicants. And that was the real threat. Because once a nation realizes it doesn't need validation, it becomes dangerous to the status quo. Meanwhile, the West doubled down. More sanctions, accusations, more isolation. But each attempt met diminishing returns. Iran had built parallel systems, parallel banks, parallel diplomacy, parallel trade routes. The West could cut off one vein, but the body kept moving, stronger, smarter, more agile. And in that transformation, Iran discovered something profounding. Resistance wasn't just a strategy. It was an identity. The Islamic Republic had branded itself as the voice of the voiceless, the defender of Palestine, the thorn in the side of empire. Whether loved or loathed, Iran had become impossible to ignore. It had turned refusal into relevance, but the cost, it was heavy. Years of sanctions had broken parts of the economy. Innovation was slowed. Talent flowed. Iranians suffered. This path wasn't pain-free, but it was chosen, not imposed. And that choice mattered more than the hardship, because nations that suffer by choice write their own legacy. Nations that suffer in submission write someone else's. So Iran kept walking forward, alone if necessary, unarmed by the West, but armored in defiance. And as its missiles gained precision, as its oil found buyers, and as its alliances deepened, the geopolitical map began to shift. Suddenly, Iran wasn't the one on the defensive. It was America that was watching its influence fade. It was Israel facing uncertainty. It was Europe realizing its leverage was limited. And then came the final turn. In early 2025, a classified report leaked, one that stunned NATO allies. It showed Iran's nuclear timeline was no longer the only concern. The real threat, it stated, was Iran's ability to lead a new bloc, economically, politically, ideologically, a bloc tired of double standards, tired of wars fought for profit, tired of democracy used as a weapon, not a value. Iran, without signing anything, had become a symbol of resistance, of sovereignty, of a future no longer dictated by a handful of capitals. And so the world began to split, not into East vs West, but into two visions, one that clings to control and one that chooses codes over captivity. Iran, by refusing to sign, had chosen the latter, because sometimes a nation must stand in the storm to prove it was never meant to be tamed.